Welcome to Across the Ring. My name is William Mayhem Michaels.
This is the scientist, Carl Schupfer, and today we're here with Samuel Gately of The Headlock of Destiny. Welcome to our show.
Hey, thanks so much, guys. I'm excited to be here. I see you got the copy there.
Yeah,
Excited to see that.
Yeah, we're
Absolutely.
really, it's cool having somebody that does something a little different in the wrestling industry. And we're excited to learn about you.
Yeah, thanks.
Absolutely. So before we get started, we've already mentioned you're an author, but for our fans that don't know who you are, would you mind expanding on that a little bit and telling them who you are?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So Samuel Gately, yeah, and I write fantasy books, and I've been doing this for about 10 years. Kind of came into it late, but I've always been a huge reader, and fantasy is kind of my go-to genre, although I love reading mysteries and westerns and sci-fi and thrillers and all kinds of stuff. But I started writing, and what I always saw as kind of my niche, or the thing that I thought made stories really fun, is when you'd bring different elements into the fantasy world. So I wrote a series that was very James Bond kind of espionage, but amongst like people who rode dragons, these kind of pilot spy types. And then I wrote another series that focused on like detective work kind of within a fantasy world. And then this latest series that I've now got 4 books out in, the first one of which is The Headlock of Destiny, brings professional wrestling into the fantasy context. And I was super excited to kind of grab hold of this idea. I had been, just a huge wrestling fan kind of back in the day when I was younger, and like Macho Man Randy Savage and Mr. Perfect and Big Boss Man and Hogan and Andre the Giant. They were all, a big part of my childhood. And, I had this kind of story idea. I really wanted a giant character. I wanted the story of a viewpoint of a giant, and I kind of wanted this slacker giant who everyone was sort of like, why aren't you out, kicking the shit out of everyone?
Talking about Van?
Yeah, I'm talking about Van. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
I
I worked some summers in the warehouses, and I was a big slacker, and so I felt like it kind of fit those shoes, not from the ass kicking perspective, but when I wanted this giant type character, and I was like, but what can I give him to do? And then the idea of crossing it with pro wrestling took hold, and I just got really excited about how much fun you can have in a fantasy context with some of those pro wrestling storylines and archetypes and characters. And so, I've met a lot of people in the wrestling world because of this, and they've been fantastic. So it's just been a ton of fun since I've sort of dove into that.
Heck yeah. And reading your book, it kind of takes me back. Fantasy, it kind of takes me back to a simpler time, because it talks about like smaller village and stuff like that. And I use a lot of the older terms. But one of my questions was, you mentioned Macho Man Randy Savage. Is that where the idea of savage came from in your book?
Yeah, that was kind of the inspiration for that character. Yeah. And it kind of, I feel like the savage who sort of is in that first chapter, right? That introduction, and then he doesn't really show
the
up
prelude.
again.
Right.
Yeah. I didn't want to go. I didn't want to bring in the big heavyweights and like focus on them too much. Like I didn't want to put a big Hulk Hogan right in the center stage. I didn't want Randy Savage right in the center stage, because I wanted to use those characters and those archetypes, to sort of orient people and kind of give them a flavor. But I want people to see that, these are sort of riffs on the characters or some kind of new ideas, a spin, if you will. And like the Macho Man, when you hear his voice, right, that's all you can hear, right? We all just know exactly what it sounds like in our brains. So.
And I really like that, Van is kind of the focal point, because he was the 2-man, the smaller guy, the slacker. But I also love the fact that with the Titans, you kind of got into the backstory where most Titans killed, their mothers usually die at birth, and the fathers aren't there because they're going off to train to be these great fighters or whatever. And I love the fact that you also introduce them as different races and different, like they're not like all just tall and white. You know what I mean? You
Mhm.
definitely put different character works into the body for them. So I thought that was a really good idea. When I know you said you've written fantasy before, what really inspired you to be like, you know what, I loved wrestling as a kid. I want to throw this into a book.
It was just, it kind of came as a bit of a bolt of lightning, right? I mean, the first thing I had in my head was, for me, it usually starts with a character, right? And
Mhm.
like I could see this sort of slacker giant and everyone on him, like, why aren't you, the man right now?
Mhm.
And it was looking for something for him to do. And then when I got that, well, what if, there's this fighting, this almost like the way that the book set up, the Headlock of Destiny is a tournament, right? And
Mhm.
it's sort of shapes the fates of nations, right? It's
Right.
like the
Yeah.
World Cup on steroids, right? Like if your nation does well, it's great for everyone, and if you do poorly, like it just really drags everyone down. And so I wanted this combat to be absolutely central. And so I had this idea of giants doing combat, and immediately, right? Like you picture, the
Mhm.
old WWF, the WWE, the just like two men enter, one man leaves. And like what I really have enjoyed about the whole thing is just how much depth you can go into, everything that happens in the wrestling that we watch, be it televised, be it at local shows, right? Like all of those things have so much story behind them that, like, you think of something like a cage match, right? And like to do that in a fantasy context, there are a million different ways you could do it. It can be super exciting. There are scenes in this where, people are rushing the ring, like all this stuff. And because within the book, it's 100% non-fabricated, right? There's gambling,
Mhm.
there's corruption, there's all sorts of I just found it to be such a fun sandbox to play in. And
I
so
think that that's really cool because to kind of tie into actually both things that you kind of have here of the book, the wrestling and the fantasy. In my past, I used to be a big Dungeons and Dragons player,
mm,
and one
Me
thing that I
too.
would find fun would be trying to figure out how I can fit wrestling archetypes into Dungeons and Dragons because, like, to me, that's super fun, and I love that like you've kind of connected in a way that I've thought about in the past and like have been able to take it from, for me, it was goof around with my buddies to you being like, I've created this whole world and novels of story around this theme. And I think that it's so cool that you kind of done that. And I think why it ends up resonating with so many people is that, there's a lot of people in wrestling that love fantasy, right? And they love stories, right? Like people that are in wrestling, we often hear on our show, that I love to tell stories. I love to, create meeting. And like you're able to, kind of, take the spirit of what they, are so desperately trying to express and, bringing it into a new medium that allows people to enjoy it beyond just what they're able to watch, within an arena.
yeah, thanks, Carl. I've definitely it's been really fun going to the local events, right? And selling books. And I'll tell you, the first time I set up, I had no idea what the hell was going to happen, right? Like I was like, am I going to get beat up? Like, but a lot of people kind of came up and they said, hey, like I'm super into fantasy or D&D, and like
Mhm.
I'm thrilled that you're here. And they would have great conversations with me. I remember someone specifically coming up and being like, hey, I used to play D&D and I would always be a professional wrestler. And like we talked about what that meant. Like, yeah, you're big and you're strong and you got charisma, right? You're in the middle of a crowd. But maybe you're not the brightest cat, you got to give it up somewhere. So
Yeah.
yeah, there's tons of I think it's really fertile ground. And yeah, I mean it's all about that storytelling element because that's a huge part of what's going on, in an individual match, in a show, right? Like it's really it's the storytelling is a huge part of delivering, the
Yeah.
wrestling entertainment product.
And I think too, like kind of a last piece here too is with your character being kind of an underachiever, right? And some of it's like you've got all this going for you, like you like bigger than you are. that's not something that's foreign to wrestling either, right? Like there's,
Mm.
whether they're people on TV that you expected to, reach certain heights that they never reached, or even someone, locally that like has a ton of talent, but maybe doesn't have the drive to, fully realize their potential. I think it's, really cool that you've been able to, even like your central character and these themes, do resonate with, what happens, without the fantasy elements. So I think that that's, really cool. To kind of, lean on the wrestling side of it a little bit, you mentioned, you're a wrestling fan as a kid, and that's kind of where you kind of pulled the inspiration from. How did you end up getting introduced to wrestling as a kid and become a fan?
Yeah, so it wasn't through my family. I mean, my dad did nothing but mock anytime it was on the TV, right? I had an older brother who helped a bit. And I think it was mostly through my friends, like we would all kind of get together and we'd watch some of the shows. I very vividly remember going to the Bradley Center. Carl, you're in Milwaukee, right?
Yep, yep, yep.
Yeah, going to shows at the Bradley Center, and I remember like the British Bulldog, seeing him and like Honky Tonk Man. And I think Honky Tonk might have been the headliner. And at the end of the show, all the crowd had gathered around the ring and they were just screaming obscenities at him. And he was screaming obscenities back. I was in like fourth or fifth grade and I was just like awed by the energy, right? And like just the daring of it all. So yeah. And then, I've got some friends who are like super into like Mr. Perfect. We talk about Mr. Perfect a lot,
Mhm.
and I'll tell you, man, I mean, a lot of this stuff, I love the local shows now, the ones that I've been lucky enough to be introduced to through Mondo Lucha and like freelance wrestling in Chicago. I'm headed to the show in Berwyn. I think it's Masters of the Squared Circle. And then I've been up to the Great Lakes Championship Wrestling show up in Cedarburg. And so it's been awesome to sort of re-enter the world of pro wrestling via the local shows, which are fantastic. But then also, when I'm writing this stuff, I do a little bit of kind of research, and a lot of that's like YouTube of old promos and old matches and stuff. And I'll tell you, man, I mean, like I love the comedy. Like the like if you listen to some of like the Mr. Perfect promos, like they're unbelievable. Like some of these guys, I mean, they just really had that presence and just that ability to deliver a joke, whether it's really a joke or not a joke,
Mhm.
and so it's that nostalgia piece has been big for me as I've kind of, sort of re-entered this world.
I think, you're expressing like the love that you found with like attending local wrestling shows. I think we both found a lot with these different conversations with fans, because Will and I go to a lot of wrestling shows as well, that you will hear kind of a similar thought that like, going to these local shows gives you like a reawakening of like your appreciation for wrestling. Like, watching on TV and stuff like as a child is like, awe-inspiring, right? And then you get a little older and maybe it grows stale on you, but then when you get to go in person and you're in these venues that are allow you to really interact with wrestlers in a way that you might not have ever interacted before, it creates like a whole new experience that you didn't even realize wrestling could create. And it sounds like that's something that's really helped you, drive these books forward.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I mean, just the humor aspects, I mean, I never come away from a show without having busted a gut at a couple of things that happened. I mean, I love the athleticism. I love the big guys, but it's a lot of the kind of quirky, the kind of weird stuff that really gets me going.
And I'm glad you said that because that kind of reminds me of a guest that we had on prior before with,
Kill City.
yeah, Kill City Cup. That's one of the things that I love about pro wrestling is that funny, goofy, weird, oddball type stuff that you're just not going to get anywhere else. You know what I mean? And it's something that I gravitated towards from a young age. When I was watching it with my grandfather. So, you're a wrestling fan when you were younger. When you decided that decided that you wanted to become an author, you said it happened later in life. What really initially was like your thought process when you're like, you know what, I'm going to write my first book? When you were like, you know what, this is going to be the first one. I'm going to try it out and see how that goes. What pushed you towards that?
Yeah, so it was kind of an it was odd timing, I would say. My wife and I had just had our first kid. We were kind of, we were homebound a lot. We were, taking care of the kid. And I have always been a big daydreamer. I'm always kind of writing stories in my head. And I got a particularly vivid one and I just started putting it down on paper. And I kind of decided to challenge myself like, hey, you always do this thing where you're thinking of a story and you just kind of go over and over until it gets stale and then you wander off to something else. What if you tried to grow it? What if you tried to grow it into a book? What would that feel like, or would that work for you? And there's this thing that is called National Novel Writing Month. I don't know if you guys have ever heard this. They call it NaNoWriMo. And it's
I don't
actually
think I
no,
have.
it's actually November, right? So every November, there's this huge group of people who are like, hey, we're gonna form a collective group and we're all gonna try to write a book in November. And it's like you certain number of words per day. And it's insane. And I never would have succeeded at it. But it does have a lot of rules about how to write a book. And the
Mhm.
biggest thing is quit going back and saying that, oh, this sucks, I'm garbage, I'm terrible, I'll never be successful, I'll never finish this book, right? It's basically like go forward. And so I followed some of those rules to get through that first book. And I mean, when I write, I don't strictly only move forward. I kind of do it in a looping pattern where I sort of go back, but I force myself to continue to move. And I vividly remember the first time I realized I was approaching the end of my first book and I was getting ready to write the words "the end." And it was one of the better feelings of my life. Like I just
Mhm.
felt incredible. Like I felt like I'd done this thing and I was really proud of it. And I've been chasing that feeling ever since, right? Like I love that moment when you know how the story is going to come together, right? That moment
Mhm.
when you're so excited to get to that next part, to get the reader there. And I've gotten a lot stronger as a writer over time and like continue to work on my craft. And so there's a little less of that wincing, when I see what I've written, right? Like, oh, that's not that great, right? I'll tell you, your guys' interview with Charles Cassis with
Mhm.
R3, I really enjoyed that interview. I really liked the stuff he was talking about, the self-betterment and like you need to hear what you can do better and just constantly be pushing yourself to do better, because that's something that I've had to embrace, in the writing world, right? Like
Mhm.
I work with professional editors, like I work with beta readers, and it can be really tempting to brush off criticism, right? Or just be like, whatever, you didn't get it or whatever. But like the key to being successful at this, as with wrestling or really anything in life, right? You've got to keep improving to get to the best you can. And so I really appreciated the message in that. And yeah, so 10 years, I've been writing. I've got 9 books out and no plans on stopping.
Yeah, that's good to hear. And that's something that me and Carl can both relate to because we're always talking after interviews, usually after I'm done editing, and we're like, "Oh, we could have did this, we could have did that. Man, I wish I'd have said this." And that happens a lot, but then we're like, "You know what? But we'll remember that for next time." Because I'm glad that you brought up Charles. Charles is one of the first ones where we really started pushing for storytelling rather than just asking questions. And
Mhm.
Charles really put that over for us, and I think that's helping us along, and that's why I'm so glad with your answers and your responses. It's you have so much to say. With that said, you got into writing. How did your family react? Like, how did the support look, especially with your wife and you just having your first child? How did that go for you?
It went well. I mean, my wife's super supportive. I've got a lot of friends who have been really supportive. And so that's been great. I have, I have a day job, but I've sort of dialed things back over time to spend more time writing. And, that requires my family to adjust to that,
Mhm.
and they've been champs about it. So I'm really glad to have that kind of support. There haven't been too many people in my life who've been like, what the hell are you doing? But there have been a few, but they can wander off and someplace else.
Right. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Those people that are gonna say, you're crazy for doing it or whatever, but it's the support system that keeps you going. I think that that's really cool. And I also like, the fact that, you're so driven, and you you look at each book as a challenge that needs to be, achieved, right? Or overcome, or however you look at a challenge. And I feel like that's something that resonates, no matter what, passion you're chasing. For a wrestler, seeing like, okay, what's the challenge for how to make my, to reach that next goal? Or for a podcast, how do you challenge to, okay, how does the episode get better? Or, even something outside of that, right? If you're a weightlifter, how, your challenges there, or maybe it's something simpler than that. I think that the challenges that you talk about are extremely relatable, and I think it's really cool that you have such a strong support system that allows you to really pursue that passion and challenge in a way that you know people aren't always lucky to have.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you're always going to have haters, but
Yeah.
I just let the haters fuel me, especially since getting this podcast started. I had people that were legitimately like, if you keep posting this wrestling crap, I'm going to delete you on Facebook. And I'm like, bye, see you.
Right.
Like, this is my goal in life. This is something that Carl and I have got to do for ourselves. So something that makes us happy, as I'm sure writing does for you. But one of the things that I have a question for you, as far as like getting into writing, like what are some of your biggest challenges when you were transferring into this? What were some of your setbacks?
Yeah, I mean the the management of sort of, confidence and self-esteem, I think is a huge part because, when you're at it day after day on these huge projects, right? They sometimes you feel like you're the king of the world and you're crushing it, and you're like, like I'm just on the right track, no obstacles in my path. And then other days you're just like, what am I doing? For me, I have kind of a creative partner, Adam Rose, who's up in Milwaukee, who's been a lifelong buddy of mine. When I kind of conceived of this idea right away, I pulled him in and I was like, hey, this is what I'm thinking about. Like,
Mhm.
could you kind of come on this journey with me? Because I know, like, when you start writing a book, right? Like especially when you're juggling other things, like it's going to take a long time. And so
Mhm.
you're going to have a long time to second guess your decisions, right? So I knew that from the moment I put the first words of the Headlock of Destiny down on page to the moment I'm showing it to people as a completed version, right? There's going to be a huge opportunity for self-doubt and what am I doing? This it's pretty unique. I mean, to be honest, like I'm not tooting my own horn. It's almost worrying that there aren't other, fantasy wrestling or sci-fi wrestling. There's not that much out there. And so I was worried that I was just, doing something crazy. And so having like a creative partner on the journey to bounce ideas off of so that he can get excited about things, I can get excited about things, we can swap, ideas, like that was a big part. I'm really glad that I brought someone in to like be a part of that. I'm sure you guys can fondly look at each other when you relate that to your own podcasting experience, I hope.
Oh yeah.
It's easier to have a friend along for the ride for sure.
There's been a lot of times where one of us texts the other like, man, I am so glad I'm working with you on that, on
Yeah.
the podcast. And sometimes it's not even just like the podcast itself. Like, sometimes it's like, the two of us have to work through some sort of, thing that we're trying to solve for. And other times it's just like, man, like I had just a crap day, and like having this person that you're working with, on a project, like just helps boost you and like kind of keeps you,
Mhm.
pushing forward. And, it sounds like that's kind of what you've got there as well. It's like a secondary support system that's, just different than what's at home, you know?
Absolutely.
And so kind of thinking about different stuff, and we like to not only like understand you and understand kind of your body of work and what you've done so far, but we also like to learn about our guests in terms of like their mindsets and things like that. And with that kind of in mind, for you, like what do you think is like the best thing about being an author?
Yeah, no, that's kind of, I appreciate the question. It's not a hard one for me, right? It's when people read the book and give me positive feedback, and ideally like, oh man, like I totally get what you were trying to do here. Like that's the thing where I'm just like, yes, thank you. That's what I really want. The things that just make me like overjoyed that I've chosen this path, right, is like when I go to the shows. The last time I was at the Mondo Lucha show in Milwaukee, a bunch of people came up and they were like, hey, do you have more of these? I read them and they were great. Like, when's the next one's coming? And I was like, I got you, man. And thank you, for telling me that. Like that really makes my day. And then so I'm in the process of releasing two more books. So Rematch of the Titans, which stars a new Titan, Scott Flawless, who may have some resemblance to Mr. Perfect and a bit of a heel. It's two books focused on his story. So Rematch of the Titans just came out, I don't know, 6 days ago. And then there's another one coming out December 7th, and that's The Jaws of Hell, which is another Scott Flawless story. And so I'm sort of in the process now of collecting advanced reviews, right?
Mhm.
And so I got the first one yesterday that was like, dude, like I saw exactly what you did here in building these themes and like putting it all together so that these parts were particularly exciting and devastating in turn. And I was like, yes, like that is what I'm after. Like that is what makes it, and I mean, it's the same as wrestling, right? That's what makes
Mhm.
it go over, right? That's when the crowd pops. It's like it's much more indirect, right? But when you hear someone tell you like, man, I was reading your books and I had those moments, like that's what I want. That's what I'm after. So
So what's really funny for me is when Carl first told me, I was super skeptical. I was sitting there like, I don't know, man. And he's like, man, you just, we'll find out. And I actually got my book on my birthday. So I was like, hey, and I'm a huge reader as it is. It's
nice.
just, I have never really jumped into fantasy, and I don't know why, because like Carl, I played D&D all through like high school and stuff. So I was just like, and honestly, I picked it up and I really got into it pretty quickly. And it was something that I actually got excited about. And then I was like, you know what? Yeah, let's do this. And he's like, all right. And it's really interesting and entertaining to me. I I honestly felt like it was hard to put down. And I'm excited to see the next book, since this is still the first one. So I'm really excited to what happens next. So it's really cool that you really put this out into the universe, right? Even though I was a skeptic.
You're absolutely
um
old now. Like, you know what? Like this guy's writing speaks for itself. You pick up
Mhm.
page one, and you're like, this guy gets it, and it sucks you in. So, kind of in that vein, you talk about, the best stuff is kind of that feedback loop. And that's similar to a wrestler, but for you, the feedback, like you said, is way slower, right? Like it's
Mhm.
not, the book's out and immediately you hear, a roaring crowd of, oh my God, the book, right? Like
Yeah.
there's delayed gratification. And that must be a bit of a challenge, like you talk about like, the day to day, right? The daily grind of working through a project and not getting that immediate, feedback. Do you feel that with the, delayed gratification, do you think that that kind of helps really drive it to you, that like sure you had to wait for it, but it's like that much stronger because of it was finally there for you?
I mean, I think that like having that drive to make it as good as possible is like a huge part of writing. It's like you're sort of slowly building something, right? And you really gotta make it as solid and as good as you can. Readers nowadays are pretty fickle, right? Like they want to get to the action, like they want books to bop, like they really, and so you really have to put in time and energy into like crafting something that's great. So like I feel like it helps to sort of, appreciate how much hard work needs to go in to get there. One of the things that was sort of eye-opening for me is, one of the things they say in the writing community is, you've never seen like Stephen King's first draft. You've never seen it. Like it's always gone through multiple iterations. It's gone through the best professional editors. So when you do your first, I mean, I just did a short story about this wrestler Phantom Manley, like qualifying for the Headlock of Destiny. I'm going to put it out as a free short story for anyone who signs up for my mailing list. So keep your eyes open for that. I'll send you guys a copy for sure.
Okay.
But it's almost like Phantom Manley, like hunting down this other Titan who's ducking him for the qualifiers, and this almost like Point Break style situation. But I got it back from my editor, and he's like, dude, you got a lot of work to do. Like you got to tighten this up. You got to put in some more obstacles. Like can't just be smooth sailing for the man,
Yep, you got to create conflict.
Yeah. So just like being appreciative of it, it takes work. Like it's a grind, and like you will get there, but if you work hard enough, if you got the right ideas, you'll get there. So I just like, you have to bring that kind of worksmanship, to writing, right? You can't just imagine like you're going to type out in the computer and people are just going to be fainting all around you because you're so brilliant, it's hard work.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
that makes a lot of sense, and that's really cool that you kind of like you enjoy the day-to-day process, and it's not just the obviously the having the feedback and like when things are well received and people get what you're doing, like that's incredible, and feeling, but like also like just enjoying your process and enjoying kind of where you're going, that I think that's kind of what we relate to as well. We're like, yeah, we put out an episode and like it's exciting when you see people are really like starting to watch it and stuff and all that. But even talking with you here, or if we're making graphics or whatever, like it making sure that the entire process is fun, I think is like essential to success for really any avenue that you want to kind of pursue. But kind of looking for your own insights when it comes to being an author, what do you think is something that you think everybody else could be doing but doesn't do?
What's something I think everybody else could be doing and doesn't do? I mean, I'm very much in the fantasy space, right? Like it's my favorite genre to read. At some point I might write outside of it, but like I do really like the fantasy genre. I feel like it gives you the freedom to play around and it's just kind of fun. But I do feel like there's a somewhat surprising lack of risk taking. I feel like for for the imagination that's involved in writing fiction, I do think that you see a lot of the sort of popular stories kind of repackaged over and over. And I get it, right? Like there's some great stuff out there and we kind of like what we know, but I wish people took more risks, Like I would go nuts if I saw other fantasy wrestling books on the market, right? I would like be so excited, or like there are all kinds of different amazing stories that can be written. And I wish fantasy in particular, but other genres as well, I wish they would more embrace some of the kind of wackier ideas, the stuff that's a little more out there. I feel like sometimes it kind of plays it safe. Now there are definitely exceptions to that. Like this book, Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Eames, is one of the things that really helped my career because he brought rock stars into the fantasy world and it was killer, really good stuff. And there's a book out right now, The Combat Codes, which is mixed martial arts and sci-fi together. And that's some really cool stuff. So like I do think there's some cool stuff out there. It just kind of bums me out when a lot of the stuff on the market and stuff done by incredible writers is sort of the same kind of stuff. So that's something I'd like to see a little more of, is a little more risk taking, I guess.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think like that's something you know, whether you're a writer or elsewise, you know, taking risks and trying to stand out, I think is important.
Yeah, and I feel like that's one of the benefits of the kind of the local shows, right? Is you'll always
Mhm.
see people trying crazy stuff, you know. And I think you don't see that as much on the, you know, the big televised shows. I mean, sometimes you do, right? Like they know to push the envelope, but just some really kind of that zany, wacky stuff. I feel like the local shows, you get some cool stuff there.
Well, what I loved about your book, like, so I'm really big into like biographies, autobiographies. Like, I've read Trevor Noah's, which is absolutely funny. Like I said, I've never really traveled into like fantasy books. Yours is my first one, but I found a lot of comedy in it. And I found a lot of relation when it came to like biographies, because it is telling a story about Van, and I absolutely love that aspect of it. I mean, that's why I started the podcast. I met Carl and I was like, hey, I have this idea, come on this journey with me. And getting to know people, their personality, their stories, that's what people really bite into. And you really succeeded with that in this particular book. I'm excited to read the next ones and see where it goes from here. But for you, like, what do you think was probably the hardest thing in writing this series for you?
One of the things, so I was worried in starting this series. I knew that Headlock of Destiny was going to be a tournament story, right? And I
Mhm.
knew that what I really wanted to do was a bracket, right? Single elimination. I was like, this is going to be great. I I like to force myself into structures when I write. It kind of helps me keep the story moving. It helps keep things on track. And so I knew that that bracket, right, that's going to push Van into these competitions. We're going to be meeting new dangerous Titans and it's going to be great. The thing that I was really worried about was writing so many fights. I certainly had never written a wrestling match, right? And I was like, is this going to be captivating, or is this going to be like a list of moves that some people won't be able to wrap their heads around? And so I was apprehensive about how that piece would go. The thing that helped me a lot is that what I tried to do is focus on a different element of the fight in each one. So there are fights where a lot of it's more about what's going on in Van's head than in the
Mhm.
ring, right?
Right.
And then there are fights where it's almost more about the crowd than about the wrestlers, right? And then
Mhm.
you can bring in the physical space, right? You can have the stadiums crumbling apart as they throw each other around it. Or there are other wrestlers interfering and the center of focus is pulled around, or you're focusing on the ref for a fight. And so I have tried to sort of keep that fresh, right? I didn't
Mhm.
want anyone, especially. I'm trying to write for wrestling fans and for people who really only have a casual knowledge of wrestling, and I don't want people to be sort of bored to tears if I'm describing, pile drivers and stuff ad nauseum.
Right.
And so like trying to keep each fight interesting, I found that as a challenge. And the tool that I used to hopefully succeed there was like focusing on different elements so that no two fights read exactly the same. But
Mhm.
I hope, if someone reads all four books, they're not getting to the end and being like, man, I cannot read another Titan fight. I was worried that I would get to the end of the first book and be like, I cannot write another Titan fight. But now I'm
Mhm.
at four and I kind of want to keep going. So
Yeah.
Well, that's what we want to hear. It sounds like
yeah,
there's still a lot of story to tell. So we're glad that you're still inspired to continue your story. So I love that.
totally.
All right, guys. Well, that's it. We're going to go ahead and wrap it up. Sam Gately, I want to thank you so much, man, for coming on here to Across the Ring.
Yeah, absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me, guys.
Absolutely, brother. And I want you guys to make sure you go ahead and check out these books, check out everything he's got. Sam, you're on Instagram and Facebook, right?
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Make sure you guys
Samuel
give him a
Gately,
follow.
yep. Headlock of Destiny. You can find me anywhere.
Heck yeah. Where can they get your books at?
So the books are available on Amazon and they're ebook, paperback, and then I also have audiobooks available for the first two. There are 4 books out there. You can start with Headlock of Destiny, or you can start with Rematch of the Titans, which just came out a few days ago, because those both start fresh stories in the same world. And then the audiobooks will be out for all 4 eventually, but right now there's audiobooks for 2 of those. And there's a great narrator. So if you're a fan of audiobooks, I definitely recommend checking those out as well.
Oh, there you go, guys. And if you guys aren't following us or following Sam, make sure you go ahead and follow. Give this video a like. We're on every platform. If you just want to listen to us talk instead of watching the video, we're on everything, Spotify and everything else. But as always, guys, you never know who will be across the ring.